Because carbon is a complex topic, we decided that each year we would kick off our summit with a Carbon 101 session. This session will bring us all together and get us to a common understanding of the topic. Marty Seymour, COO of our Carbon RX organization, has 25 years experience in business development and finance. In Marty's previous role with Farm Credit Canada, he engaged with national industry associations, government officials, and industry influencers to help advance the interests of Canadian agriculture in areas of carbon management, carbon sequestration, and First Nations agribusiness. Please welcome up Marty, who will walk us through his learnings about carbon and its impacts on climate change. Marty?
All right. Thanks, Pat. Well done. All right, good morning, everyone. Just do a quick sound check. Dave, we're good? Got good audio? All right. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be gathered here for the third time. And as Pat said, this idea was born out of our observation of how people were just generally carbon curious, didn't understand the space. It was an emerging industry, emerging sector. And I was working for Farm Credit Canada 3 years ago, looking at national trends and strategy and industry opportunities, and I saw the emergence of carbon, and I jumped into this because I wanted to help farmers get paid or monetize the carbon they had on their land, and I thought, wow, this would be super easy. And I've since realized that this is not easy. This is a complex topic. It's difficult and it's hard, but what I have been able to validate is those people in agriculture, forestry, and hydrocarbons, those people that are on the land are actually in control of the carbon economy. If you control the land, you control carbon. And so what I wanted to bring to you today is a little bit of my journey of the last 2 or 3 years where I've become absolutely immersed in this topic, from a kid who grew up on a small farm in Saskatchewan to someone that's trying to build a business inside of this emerging carbon conversation, and maybe share some of the things that I wish I had known in the early days that would have short-circuited some of my decisions today. And we've got a pretty diverse room here today, from industry, agriculture, there's forestry, there's investment, there's a little bit of everybody in the room here. And so hopefully you can leverage the breaks and network a little bit and do, I think, what we've enjoyed with our organization is diversify our thought and diversify our network and hopefully build a better organization for all of our benefits together. You know, in the early days, meaning 3 years ago when I started carbon, it was rather political. It maybe still is. It's a rather partisan topic. And I always said in the prairies, we weren't sure where we stood on carbon. We weren't sure where we even stood on COVID, whether it was real, is this a thing? And I've come to realize that carbon's rather partisan. It's very political. And I differentiate the two. I believe this is not a debate about climate change. This is not a debate about politics. This is about carbon and looking at a way to decarbonize all of our businesses and our industries, because it's the right thing to do both environmentally, but it's also economically. And so my desire was to build a business and have people participate in it without the cloud and the shroud of a debate around climate, and just focus on the opportunity that's in front of us. 3 years ago, I would have said I was late, that the industry was advanced, is 5 and 10 years ahead of me, and oh my goodness, I got to catch up and do carbon. I've since come to realize we're still in that early adopter phase of carbon. And most of you here today, or maybe were here last year, experienced the topic a little bit, but are just generally getting up to speed. On a weekly basis, my phone would ring in Taiwan, London, New York. It's very international business. And everybody's at a different spot on this, but I think as Canadians, for the most part, it's still pretty early days. And the carbon trading side is also fairly early, so it's not too late to jump in. If you feel you're behind the 8 ball, you're actually ahead of many on the topic. My theory is if we're first, we get to set the weather in terms of what's acceptable in terms of carbon, how we measure it, how we monetize it, and what constitutes a good carbon credit. Throughout the talk, I tend to flip-flop my vernacular a bit, so I'll level set with some definitions here. But when I talk about a carbon credit, it's measured as 1 ton of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent. But I'll flip-flop between carbon, CO2, carbon credit, and language, and so you just have to sort of humor me in terms of the vernacular around that, but that's effectively some industry language that we throw around routinely. carbon crediting was born out of a rather simple system. And the first real movers in Canada, Quebec, California, Ontario, had a cap and trade system. So rather simply put, is when you think about carbon and carbon crediting, is there's a line. This was the government's approach. They drew a red line across the map and said, if a company produces more emissions than the red line allows, they will pay a tax. And if company B, in this case, produced less than the red line, so they maybe implemented a technology or did a practice change, they created a deficit or a credit. And so company B was allowed to sell those to company A, and thus was born the carbon credit markets. The whole thing is predicated on a delta, on a change. So whatever your base performance was to your new emissions level, the delta between that, if you could reduce it, created the carbon credit. It was government-centric. The governments were driving it, creating the structure. Provinces and states were trading these things back and forth. It's since diverged into two fundamental markets. This is where I think a lot of people find confusion in carbon. The first one is the compliance market. This is the kind of like the diagram I just showed you. This is the government system where people must comply. It's the penalties and the taxes that you would pay on your emissions. The right side of what you're looking at is the voluntary market. This is where most of us in the room would experience the most upside. This is where the participants volunteer to play in the carbon space. And I'm going to help explain to you why, and a speaker following me is going to even give you better definition of what's behind and what's driving it. But the voluntary carbon markets like Kijiji, a buyer and a seller just agree to participate in this thing. There's no tax relief, there's no tax incentive. They have their other reasons to do this. It might be an emotional desire to be a good corporate citizen and reduce their footprint and be sustainable. It might be access to financing. It could be lots of things, but they're volunteering to participate. This is where nature-based carbon, agriculture, forestry, and other natural things are finding their legs and growing. The compliance market's way bigger. Government taxes in Europe, Canada. I guess some markets in Asia would look at compliance taxation as a way to reduce emissions. But it's the voluntary space, the one you see in the news, that has the most growth. Because we estimate, based on the most recent data, that over 8,000 companies have made some level of commitment to be net zero. So somewhere within their DNA, they've said, look, we want to reduce our emissions. Somewhere is bold enough to say we're going to be net zero by 2050, by 2030, by 2040. Many of these did this voluntarily, and that's what's intriguing to me. And so why would they do that? It starts really anchored in financing and how they report on their balance sheets. So from an ESG standpoint, this is some definition, foundational knowledge you need to have to understand what drives big companies. This is a new way to measure corporate social responsibility, just being a good citizen. So companies measure their E, it's their environmental footprint, what they're doing around water, and just how they're generally showing up. And carbon shows up in this E bucket. The S, the social license, is the things they do around gender, diversity, inclusion. And it's our opportunity as people participating in both agriculture and First Nations carbon credit origination to brand and or sell our credits because of the high social license they have around inclusion, diversity, food, other things we're doing to give those credits a differential. And I'm going to speak to that at length a little bit later. And then governance is how we operate and manage our businesses. So E, S, and G driving a lot of behaviors in most public companies as they report and try to stand up against their peers to say, we're a great company, invest in us, work for us. And that's the opportunity. Because these groups need to report their emissions. So the big banking in Canada is where I came from and realized that, they have an obligation to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I'll speak to that in a few minutes. But because they're behind carbon and emissions, it was more solid and an anchor to build a business around than somebody that was doing it for climate alone. That I fundamentally believe the driver behind carbon is access to capital. It's access to financing. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means that lenders and pension funds are larger, I'd say a bigger catalyst to companies wanting to do this because everybody's accessing capital to grow and scale their businesses. So while most people are thinking carbon is a movement by a government or a movement by society for sustainability, under the waterline is an entire movement in lending and banking and access to financing. There's also the emergence of this, which is interesting to me for being a farm kid and an agri-food guy, is the emergence of carbon taxes or barriers to entry. And so the Europeans put on a carbon tax for these products imported into Europe, a carbon border adjustment mechanism is what they call it, CBAM. But they're taxing this list of imports. And so I had a call out of Taiwan last year and said, hey, we're going to be sending TVs into Europe, and we need to offset our emissions because they're taxing us when they land because they're made of metal. And so how could we avoid or mitigate the tax tariff on our TVs coming into Europe? And so the emergence of taxes at borders is another driver to why big companies will start to pay more attention and try to decarbonize. If you think about the fertilizer business and having to land fertilizer into the EU and pay a tax, can we be competitive? So there's lots of dynamics at play, but I really think between financing and the emergence of some of these barriers to trade really cement carbon as this is probably carbon 3.0, whereby the world has explored carbon 3 different times, and I just feel it's more sticky now than it's ever been. Okay, I want to introduce you to some of the basics and definitions, kind of how the industry works. It starts with these scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as a sort of foundational knowledge. And so I'm just going to help you with your vernacular as you hear these things. There's no quiz at the end that you have to worry about. But scope 1 emissions is what we're mostly used to. What's your carbon footprint? What is it that I'm trying to reduce or measure? Scope 2 is where our energy comes from. In a place like Saskatchewan, where we tend to have most of our energy come from coal, maybe Alberta's natural gas, we tend to have a higher emissions score as our scope 2 reports as corporations of what we consume, simply because of our energy source. It's the driver behind the renewables, the solar and the wind, is to help companies be able to reduce their scope 2 emissions reporting. And then scope 3 is the complicated one. This is your value chain. The easiest one for me to articulate is agriculture, whereby we grew barley on the farm, we sold it to an elevator, who sold it to a maltster, who put it into a beer bottle, who retailed it. There's a carbon footprint all the way along the chain. And so the retail person is expected to reverse count the carbon from, just say, a Walmart shelf all the way back to our farm. And scope 3 emissions offer the most complexity as an industry because not everybody has the data, not everybody has the information to track, measure, and monitor that. So this to me is, this is in some ways probably going to be the biggest barrier to growth of the space in terms of a sophisticated scope 3 measuring system. But it also cements carbon into lots of corporate conversations because they will be asked as public companies to report and demonstrate what their emissions are through scope 1, 2, and 3. All right, how do you get a carbon credit? How do they even come to be? Well, there's 3 foundational criteria in order to earn a carbon credit. The first definition is permanence. So if you make a practice change, if you think about those factories I showed you with the line across the middle, and someone makes a practice change to reduce their emissions, it has to be permanent, meaning the definition needs to last 100 years. So if you took CO2 out of the air and parked it in the soil, it's there for 1,000 years, you would meet the permanence. If you took an agriculture model where a growing plant captures CO2 and puts it in the soil, and then in 2 years from now you tilled the soil and that CO2 was released, that's not considered permanent. So from a threshold standpoint, a couple of definitions you have to hit. It's super easy when you're reducing emissions, when you say, I'm going to just burn less diesel fuel today. That decision, that reduction of emissions is permanent, it's simple. But when you look at the complex systems like agriculture and forestry, permanence is a real barrier to entry. Can we demonstrate the trees will be there for 100 years? But the hardest thing to get over is what's called additionality, which means if you receive money for a carbon or a practice to generate the carbon credit, did it change your behavior? In the absence of the money, if I paid you $5 and you said you would change a practice to capture more carbon, in the absence of $5, would you have done that? If the answer is no, it's a simple stress test. If the answer is no, I was going to do it anyway, it's super hard to qualify for a credit. This is a little bit where the Wild West of carbon actually is demonstrating additionality. How much stuff would we have done anyway? If in a forestry situation, would have I left those trees unharvested anyway? If the answer is yes, you technically don't qualify for a carbon credit. And the third definition is around what's called leakage. I don't talk about it a lot because we don't seem to run into it in our business day to day, but a great example is in Brazil, if you said, I'm not going to cut down the forest in this block of land, but you drove across the road and you clear cut the whole thing for 100 miles. That's leaking. You've leaked your problem to the neighbor, and by definition, you don't qualify, or you receive a bit of a haircut on how many credits you would actually get issued. Kind of back to some foundational knowledge. So we measure everything against CO2 or carbon. That's the base metric or measure. And it has a factor of 1. So the greenhouse global warming potential of carbon dioxide is 1. Methane is 28 times more potent. And this is why there's a bit of attack on the cattle industry to say cows produce lots of methane, it's 28 times worse, get rid of the cows. It's why oil and gas has a target on them. Is anything, think about those flare stacks that you see driving around northwest Saskatchewan, southeast, they're producing methane. It's 28 times more potent. So if you're a government, you're going to go after methane in oil and gas because you can have such an impact. And then nitrous oxide is fertilizer, and that's been the conversation in agriculture where we've said, hey, we've got to make sure the nitrogen fertilizer we put in the soil stays in the soil, gets used by the plant, because it's 265 times more. And this is what drives public officials to target specific industries is based on their emissions. And I love this map because this is the anchor of why Agriculture Canada has been so interested in nitrogen emissions. Just have to grab a sip. The red spots, if you look at, and you know anything about Canadian agriculture, is those are the hot spots for animal agriculture in Canada or intensive agriculture in general. So those red areas become a pretty important spot for government to say, we should reduce nitrogen use in those soils, or we should look at livestock intensity. But what's kind of luxurious there is where we are today is very green. We're actually in a really good spot to be able to capture carbon and participate in the carbon markets. So I think it's our advantage as Western Canadians that are really in the grain belt or in the forestry space to participate here. There's over 170 different carbon credits on the market, the best we can tell. That number is probably 171 as of this morning. And so it's a complex system. When I started, I thought a carbon credit was a carbon credit. But carbon credits are really about the story attached to them, the source to which they come, and the science to which is used to demonstrate the credit. So if you break that 170 down, you can kind of create a fork in the road and say there's two foundational ones, nature-based carbon and what's technology-based carbon. So nature-based that's agriculture, forestry, it's growing plants, things that happen naturally, it's cattle grazing systems. The technology stuff is the emergence of CO2 capture on an industrial oil plant, energy plant. What the picture of there is what's called direct air capture. So somebody figured out they could put these big filters and pour massive amounts of energy at them and capture CO2 out of the air and park it somewhere. And so you see technology or nature, foundationally, priced very different. Nature-based credits will trade from $1 to $50 a ton. A technology-based credit that Microsoft bought recently was $450 a ton. The technology stuff I find is a bit sensational. They pay $450 because it's super expensive to deliver, and so it requires that type of pricing. But it also has super good curb appeal and press release potential. And so I think the pricing is also somewhat inflated relative to this story attached. Removals versus reductions. I had hinted about this a little bit earlier about a reduction, meaning I burn less diesel fuel today. You see those really common in mining, oil and gas, just anybody that can reduce their fuel consumption. It's like an instant benefit, can generate a carbon credit. Removals are kind of the holy grail, because what I didn't realize early was people who buy carbon credits want to know that you've done more today than you did yesterday. So they love the idea of wherever my money goes, it's taking CO2 out of the air and doing better than we had yesterday. So if you can remove it out of the atmosphere, it's worth more as a general thumb rule than just simply reducing emissions. What's also interesting is what it costs to generate a carbon credit. This is a fairly busy infographic, but if you look at on the left, kind of your low-cost carbon crediting and measuring and validating and proving tends to be in systems that are in preservation. Maybe it's grassland preservation or forest preservation. And as you move to the right, where you're restoring wetlands and doing these massive capital infrastructures, they tend to have a lot higher cost structure to them. Credit pricing doesn't necessarily go from low to high on the left or the right. It gets a little bit more specific than that. But you have a general understanding of the different categories, and agriculture around Regina is kind of somewhere in the middle, mid-cost, mid-price. But it speaks to the complexity of how we go at these and how we generate the credits. Kind of moving to the end of my definitions and vernaculars, offsets versus insets. A carbon offset or a carbon credit is something that you generate and sell to someone else. It's just almost, we'll call it a stranger, and they use it to offset their emissions. An inset, and I use the food system the best, an inset is a system like, I'll say Cargill is a multinational food company, whereby they followed the value chain. I talked about the beer example where it went from the retail all the way back to the grower. That's where insets apply, where you follow the value chain all the way up from start to finish and count those against each other. The difference is a little bit on the validation. The offset's a harder barrier to entry. There's a little more rigor, a little more structure. Insetting's still evolving, whereby the definition of a carbon, the adjustment or the math, is still a little bit in flight. It's very similar, but the validations are not quite as rigorous or thorough, and it's easier to prove additionality or to qualify for that than it is on the offset. So you see the emergence of insets. I think you'll see them start to show up in oil and gas at some point, but right now they're still kind of at the macro level trying to just reduce emissions. But you'll see insetting in any value chain that has lots of touch points. All right, the voluntary carbon ecosystem. So the voluntary market's where we play in the most, and it's where most of you will find your upside. It's complicated, but not super complicated. You can kind of break it into four partners. There's the project developers. It's just a fancy word for what we do is come in and you identify a system and you help the client develop the whole thing from start to finish. So full service project work that you do. The registries, they're the validators. That's this third-party group that says we have a standard or a recipe, kind of like making a loaf of bread. They've told you what steps to follow. You follow it, and they will register the credit, and they will issue you the credit certificate. So they're kind of the house. They're not government. They're usually not-for-profits or independent groups. The verifiers and the validators are kind of like the accountants. They're the ones that come in and make sure everybody is following the principles, following the rules as they said they would, and verifying that this is legitimate information. And then, of course, the buyers, pretty straightforward. These are the people on the last step that make the whole thing happen. And they're the ones I think we need to pay the most attention to, because they're the ones that bear the reputation risk if they buy a carbon credit, it's later found out that it wasn't real or legitimate. And so last year, the carbon market got beat up pretty bad due to some publications out of London, England, around Brazilian projects and saying, hey, those credits weren't represented the way they really were. Some of them weren't real, some of them were misrepresented. And so the buyers bear all the risk. But to me, they're the ones we need to take the cues from. If they want to buy carbon removals in forestry, then let's build that for the group. If they want to build direct air capture systems and pay $400 a ton, let's build that. But we need to work with them in the early days as an industry. All right, so the path to the crediting is probably the least understood for people kind of entering the carbon space. We live it every day, so it's maybe less mysterious to us. But to help you kind of understand it, there's a series of steps. And kind of break it into the players. And so firstly, there has to be a contract. A good carbon project has a 20 or 40 or 50-year life. And so they tend to be very long deals, very long land deals as well. Because permanence means we need longevity in terms of that carbon credit issuance. Then we start to look at the data and the acquisition of the information, and it comes from all kinds of data sources here. And the Axiom team's here today. We've partnered with them on soil analysis and data management for carbon, because I think they have a really good progressive technology that allows us to do this with better accuracy and cover greater land base in the most economical way. But you can see there's all kinds of players in the database, and this is mostly agriculture-centric here. And then the credits get issued at the end. So kind of that's from a landowner standpoint, there's only a couple places that you really have to think about your participation. If you looked at it from what we work on our side is, firstly, we have to identify a protocol. So we look at the land, and we look at the scenario, and we say, okay, what's the recipe that makes the most sense? If it's cattle, we're going to follow, it's a different recipe than if it's forest, or if it's oil or agriculture. And so there's all these different formulas that take you back to grade 12 math, and for the most part, it's rather simple if you have the data, which my observation is, as an industry, that's the piece that we need to strengthen is the data. Lots of testing, in agriculture, it's soil testing. In trees, you measure diameter, you measure species, you measure height. There's just some foundational rules and principles. And then we got to identify a registry and a system, and so some of the decisions along the way are who's the validators and the registers. And once the validation's done, they've checked everything against the formulas, we have the carbon credits. And so lots of people wonder about the process. And if you're in carbon and you're participating in this, you need to think of it as a long game. And I think in a successful model, if you could generate this information, have the credits issued in 24 months, you've done much better than the industry standard. That number is really 24 to 36 is probably a practical response to how long it takes you to actually get the credits. All right, just kind of shifting to the back end of our talk here is pricing, because people always want to know what these things are worth. It's a super complicated conversation to talk about carbon pricing. If you remember, there's 170 credits, and I just pulled some pricing from last summer to show you. If you look at the different credits, wind, the second one is forestry, landfills, there's biogas, there's transportation, solar. You see pricing all over the place. And we get a pricing report weekly, and carbon credits would range from 60 cents to $30 and $40 right now. And so it really becomes about where did your credit come from? What's the source and the origin of it that helps drive its value? Because for us, I was hinting at it, carbon's really a data play. And so for those of you in the room that are sitting on good data, even if it's the forested area that you have, if you know the boundaries, then they're defensible. In agriculture, it's easy. The land system we have in Western Canada is very clearly defined. Then you just get into ownership conversations. But it's always around data and data management. So as much as carbon is a climate play, when you look at it from our standpoint, it's really a data play. One piece of confusion that we run into in the industry, and our premier has done this a lot in Saskatchewan, it's not wrong, it's just an area of confusion, is carbon intensity is not a carbon credit. So you'll see lots of proud moments of saying that we have the least carbon intense canola around the world, which means the amount of carbon it took to grow a bushel of canola is really low. Or you'll see it in forestry where this wood is low carbon intense because we can do it so much more efficient and better than some other region. Carbon intensity is just a measure of how much carbon went into it. Carbon credit, remember, is a delta, it's a spread. It's the difference between what I did yesterday and what I plan to do today. And that's where the crediting comes in. That's why it's called a credit. If you're an accountant, you'd understand debits and credits. But it's an easy thing to confuse. I'm a beef guy, and we spend so much time saying we've got this low carbon intense beef relative to, say, the Europeans or maybe the Brazilians. But it actually doesn't generate any revenue. It generates a story that helps us market, but the revenue actually is derived from the crediting process. So what drives the value? It's not always about the math. I said it's a data play. That's kind of the housekeeping we have to do to, that's barrier to entry to get in the business. But it's actually the co-benefits that have really surfaced in the carbon market. So we believe that a First Nations derived carbon credit is worth 25 to 30% more than one that's not. With the same hypothesis in agriculture, we continue to try to validate that as we go to market and sell the credits. But at a minimum, the story behind our credit means it's more liquid, that our credits will sell first. If you're a Canadian company who wants to buy carbon offset and it comes from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, that has value. That's different than some ambiguous source out of India or Africa or Central America. And so the co-benefits of where the money goes is actually driving the carbon credit value more than the science of and the math of doing carbon. So in closing, what do I think? What do I believe in this space? I would say I've underestimated the carbon journey from when I started to what I know today, meaning that I thought in 6 months, 12 months, we could all be having carbon credits and the thing would be churning out. And the truth is, it takes a while to get your baseline data and capture the information, measure the change, and get the quantification. So if you're going to participate in this, it's a long game. And anybody here that owns and controls land understands land's always the long game. It's the 7 generations conversation. It's why carbon fits so good in First Nations land management, because we can stay true to the values of a community and the elders and the 7 generations principle, yet generate own source revenue along the way. So it's a really nice instrument for own source revenue, and you can stay true to your values along the way. The second part is, I foundationally believe that agriculture and forestry in particular can use the carbon markets as an additional revenue source. It's another way to monetize the practices and the land management you would like to do that you need to be incentivized to participate in. And so it strikes me that, the origin of me getting into this was sitting at FCC and hearing the carbon conversation grow nationally and watching people buy carbon credits in Africa and India and foreign markets I didn't know, when I knew all of these people in the room would actually be benefactors if that money stayed at home. And so foundationally, I just think if you're in these sectors, you'd be really well served to participate and try to have that money land in Canada versus leaving. It's that simple to me. So from my standpoint, my advice always on this in closing, what can you do as an audience? I mean, just being here today, you've demonstrated the first step. If this is your second or third year, clearly you're getting your arms around the whole carbon conversation. But it's really just anchored in this, is stay curious. The industry's evolving. I think it's getting stronger. I think the barrier to entry is getting more difficult. So the longer you wait to participate, the harder it will become. But the fact that you're here is really first step, is being curious about the topic and figuring out how it works for you. So I'd like to close just by thanking you guys for coming here today to join us. This is our 3rd annual event, and I'm really excited about the diversity of our speakers. Hopefully you guys can enjoy the content as well. Thank you.